I don't know if there's any video game franchise that means as much to me as the Final Fantasy series. While there was a time I abandoned it due to childish rebellion and a resistance to change, it always manages to somehow come back into my life and remind me of why I feel so passionate about this medium. Final Fantasy VI perhaps illustrates this best, but I've found in recent years that many friends and acquaintances playing it for the first time have walked away unimpressed or regarding it negatively. Have I been blinded by nostalgia all these years? This video is my attempt to figure that out. In this playthrough, I tried to turn a critical eye towards the game's design to ascertain what the designers may have intended and what sort of playstyles the final product encourages. I refused to grind out levels so that I could best measure the game's difficulty level, and I disregarded common exploits or broken character builds that a first-time player would likely be unaware of. While this information is readily available to anyone on the internet, I wanted to limit my knowledge to that which could be gleaned from the game itself. You'll also note that I'm clearly playing the Super Nintendo version released as Final Fantasy III in the West. Given my current capture setup and outright refusal to recognize the awful visuals of the Steam version, this was the only option available to me. In order to best understand the story, I followed Clyde Mandelin's 4-translation comparison, the Legends of Localization series I highly recommend you check out. I have a link down in the description below. As usual, you can expect spoilers from here on out. When I first started this project, I had assumed the dungeons would be one of the roughest parts to trod through. Games had come a long way in the 25 years since Final Fantasy VI's release, and I expected the age to show most clearly in the many halls and branches of its primitive labyrinths. Instead, I found myself shocked several hours into the game when I realized how much I was enjoying these different dens and strongholds. After the typical opening salvo of caverns in a mountain pass, you'll find yourself rafting through river rapids, sneaking through a mansion's basement, creeping through a ghost train, and even hopping between dilapidated buildings. Final Fantasy VI provides some of the most unique and memorable set-piece locations for role-playing games of the Super Nintendo era. Nevertheless, being caught in the tide of a 16-bit trench system must seem quaint compared to the technological advances of modern games, no? Maybe in terms of big-budget shooters, but a lot of current role-playing games I've played have been limited to lengthy treks throughout a dungeon's corridors, maybe clicking a button at the end of a hall to change the layout of a prior chamber. While there's plenty of switches to flick in Final Fantasy VI, the dungeons aren't limited to this sort of interaction. The Phoenix Cave of the World of Ruin splits your entire party into 2 teams, and in order to forge ahead you'll need to swap between each group and... okay, flip some switches. Maybe not the best example to start with. So how about the dream world of Doma Castle then? You have to traverse your way through its hazy halls and disconnected doorways, loop yourself through an endless mine, and even peer into Cyan's subconscious memories in order to find your way out. Once you've been sucked into the Zone Eater's stomach, you'll need to evade and outpace the pushy sentries patrolling the platforms, or duck to safety to avoid being crushed by the ceiling. Can you wind through the rafters of the Opera House in time to prevent ultras from crushing the singing thespians upon the stage? How many treasures can you retrieve in this collapsing house before Sabin's strength gives way and it crumbles atop Celeste and the child she rushed in to rescue? Granted, a sense of variety doesn't always guarantee good execution. The corridors of the burning house of Thamasa are too narrow to effectively dodge the randomly roaming flames. The Cultist Tower, which I'll be getting into more later, is just one long, linear slog of a climb. So given my prior praise, are the dungeons actually good, or are they simply experimental? That's hard to say when viewing it from a modern perspective. I do feel that there's something special about a location like Zozo, a slum city where its denizens spit nothing but lies. While there are some mistranslations that could lead you astray on the Super Nintendo, it's still possible to work out not only which building Terra is in, but also how to get a secret tool like the chainsaw. I think what caused me to sit up and take notice of the different caverns, mountains, and strongholds was the fact that I was approaching each dungeon with a different mentality from one another. I went in expecting a primitive version of what I found most JRPG dungeons to be, long slogs down a linear corridor, occasionally branching off down alleyways hiding a switch or a treasure chest. Primitive it may be, but Final Fantasy VI just felt ambitious in its approach to dungeons in a way the genre has currently failed to meet. So sure, Ebbett's Rock may be little more than random stumbling in the dark, scooping up as much coral as you can while hoping this teleportation will spit you right back at the hungry treasure chest blocking your way. Tedious as it may be to feed the thing so much coral, it at least gave me a unique goal and, by limiting my vision, a claustrophobic atmosphere that I never experienced elsewhere in the game. Perhaps most of all, it only took about 30 minutes of my time, as most of the dungeons in Final Fantasy VI do. Perhaps that's the real trick. Give each dungeon a gimmick and make sure the player doesn't spend too much time in each one. Otherwise, you risk turning each dungeon into a slog whose gimmick overstays its welcome. Superficially speaking, I'd say the enjoyment found in turn-based combat is in the tactical options available. These are most commonly represented as elemental or weapon vulnerabilities. However, I think the real special ingredient comes from the satisfaction found in efficiency. It's not enough to hammer away at an enemy's weakness, but in building your party in such a fashion that you can tear apart the opponent with minimal resources spent. Final Fantasy VI is no different, albeit in a more primitive form. In each dungeon and territory, you'll be challenged with a variety of foes specifically grouped to challenge the player in specific ways. The satisfaction comes not from simply beating them, but from figuring out the best way to unravel their defenses and eliminate them with the least amount of magic, health, and time spent. The Cultist Tower is simultaneously one of the best and worst examples of this in action. The seemingly endless stairwell restricts players to using the magic and item commands exclusively. Physical combat or character-specific abilities are unavailable, and the many spell-slinging combatants you'll face are preemptively enchanted with a reflect spell. This means your only method of offense is bound to be tossed right back at you. In order to survive the tower, you'll first need to come up with a basic suitable strategy, most likely starting by equipping everyone in your party with a wall or reflect ring. It was in the Cultist Tower that I began to develop a greater understanding of the game's spell-based mechanics. Under most circumstances, casting magic on a single target results in more damage than on multiple opponents, but when relying on reflection, you never know which foe the spell will land on. Bounce that same offensive spell off your entire party, however, and each reflection will stack damage when landing on the same opponent. This can result in more damage dealt depending on how many stacks you get. Simultaneously, and I wish I thought to employ it more during my own Climb this playthrough, spells like Demi and Quarter bypass reflection altogether, as do the magic point absorbing Osmos and resurrecting Life 3. While I struggled through the first iteration of each encounter type, I gradually found a strategy for every battle. So to better clarify, the tactical options could be exemplified as understanding that undead foes will be slain if life is cast on them, or that you can counter an enemy's reflection by bouncing a spell off of your own. Efficiency comes in understanding how to exploit the mechanics most effectively to result in the swiftest victory, such as bouncing spells off the entire party just to hit one or two foes, thus increasing damage dealt with fewer magic points spent. Or if you're smarter than I was this playthrough, at least experimenting with Demi and Quarter to see if you can drastically reduce enemy health first. The problem with my desired objective analysis is that I'd already played Final Fantasy VI when I was younger. I already knew what to expect with the Cultist Tower. Imagine playing for the first time and not knowing to bring the reflective relics with you. Imagine reaching the top of the tower only to discover the boss on the roof casts Ultima before dying, wiping your entire party out and forcing you to do it all again. Imagine finally surviving that final attack by casting Life 3 on your party, only to discover that you can't warp out of the tower and the encounters on the way down are stronger. Back in 1994, a lot of the game's audience were kids or early-stage teenagers capable of spending after-school hours tackling such trials. Even if you rage quit that day, the next day you might speak to your friends at the lunch table to figure out a new approach. Or perhaps one of you owned a strategy guide you could consult. It's easy to forget about the initial learning curve, but the Mage's Tower in Final Fantasy VI is a perfect example of punishing the player for ignorance. While it is possible to learn these more efficient strategies, someone coming in clean may have a lot of trial and error to cut through just to understand what a lot of experienced players consider the basics. Now, I do mean it when I say the Cultist Tower is the worst in that regard. No other location pulls such a combat gimmick on the player, and instead favors challenge through status ailments, elemental vulnerabilities, and counterattacks. While the player may thrash about in each dungeon's initial encounters, it's more than possible to learn which enemies to turn into an ineffectual imp, or which undead targets can be buried back beneath the dirt with a life spell, including certain boss monsters. Unfortunately, what this means is that, especially in the less tactically complicated early parts, the game can get stuck in repetition. Once you have that efficient tactic, you'll likely be using it every encounter in that dungeon. This is where Final Fantasy VI benefits from the aforementioned short length of its dungeons. The player has enough time to learn and understand the encounters of each location before they start to grow tiresome and tedious. As we also saw in the Mage's Tower, what few longer dungeons there are will often change what sort of enemy groupings the player will face in order to prevent combat from getting stale. However, if you decide to grind levels, you can easily become so overpowered you don't really need a solid strategy. As an example, I tackled the ruins of Narsh following the more challenging Phoenix Cave, which meant my party was likely at a higher level than intended. An incomplete party of 3 was able to just roll on through, relying on basic physical attacks without any greater strategy needed. This explains why, when I was younger and relied heavily on grinding, I was able to wipe whole battlefields exclusively with the power of Edgar's auto crossbow or Sabin's fire dance. In the end, however, Final Fantasy VI's system is most rewarding to players that experiment and try new things. Be it with swapping out party members or switching spells, combat is at its best when you're not just mindlessly spamming the same attacks. This has the unfortunate side effect of being most rewarding on repeat playthroughs, when you have a better sense of what to expect in each dungeon and therefore are able to plan your approach more wisely. The real question is whether the game actively encourages such experimentation. It's possible to manipulate stats and equipment enough to turn certain characters into powerhouses, but on the whole, I'd say the one unique element of Final Fantasy VI actively pushes players away from such creative and varied loadouts. The catalyst to this recent visit into my childhood, and therefore this video, was a simple question. Do the stat bonuses of the different Magicite encourage specific kinds of character builds? In other words, is there a correlation between the spells on Magicite that boost strength per level up, and what sort of character builds they'd benefit? So, would a physical character like Sabin benefit from a specific set of Magicite? Before I discuss my conclusions, I should explain to anyone unfamiliar that Magicite is Final Fantasy VI's evolution of the crystal motif found in nearly every entry in the series. While each elemental crystal unlocked a new set of character classes in Final Fantasy V, these different crystals teach specific spells. An added benefit to many of them is an additional boost to certain stats per level up. So a character equipped with, say, Ramu will gain an additional point of stamina per level up, while a character equipped with Ifrit will gain an additional point of strength. With Kefka's Tower, the final dungeon, dividing the party into 3 teams, I began to wonder if the different characters were intended to fill specific combat roles, such as healer, glass cannon, tank, and so forth. That separation into teams, combined with the different stat boosts on the Magicite, formulated my theory. A theory quickly proven to be totally wrong as I gained just a handful of new Magicite. The stat boosts seem impacted more by what kind of spells are on the Magicite, so you'll become physically or mentally stronger with Magicite loaded with offensive spells. There's also a bit of a cost-benefit element, where any Magicite with restorative magic or select superpowered spells offer no stat modifiers. In other words, if you want to heal your party, you must temporarily forego the benefits offered by other Magicite per level up in order to learn those healing spells. As the system is designed, Final Fantasy VI is the first game in the series to push players into completely ignoring character classes and just turning everyone into a mage. Sure, every character is also in some way physically capable, but even Edgar's tools, so much more powerful in the world of balance, are swiftly outclassed by magic in the world of ruin. The real shame is that, prior to everyone learning magic, I was able to begin categorizing them into certain kinds of combat roles that fit my initial thesis. This is where I imagine a lot of experienced Munchkin players will want to object, explaining all these well-known methods for turning select characters into devastating blade wielders capable of downing a foe with a single slice of the blade. That it's possible or not isn't necessarily the issue. Once more, if you know what you're doing, then yes, it's totally possible. For example, if you know how to turn the Cursed Shield into the Paladin Shield, then you could just teach your party members all those aforementioned healing spells while grinding out 255 battles on the solitary island, where you gain no experience. You learn magic, but don't miss out on any stat bonuses gained via level up. It's Munchkin-style efficiency. The point isn't what's possible if you know what you're doing. It's in what direction the game design most naturally pushes the player. It's far easier to build a world-raising spellcaster, such as what I managed with Terra in my no-grind run-through, than it is to build a legendary swordsman. This doesn't mean it is completely pointless even for a first-time player to try and manipulate stats with Magicite, though. Sabin's different blitzes are tied to either strength or magic power, so if you have preferred attacks like Suplex or Aura Bolt, you can equip him with whichever Magicite is most likely to transform into a boisterous bear of a grappler. Most character abilities are so easily outclassed by the strength of magic though, that it's just more beneficial and the least trouble to teach every character every spell you conceivably can, which becomes a Herculean task once you realize how many characters you need to be swapping out. Fans often cite the vast array of characters in Final Fantasy VI as one of its greatest features, but I've come to wonder if it's actually one of its greatest detriments. While the game will average everyone's levels out at certain story points, you'll need to keep them in rotation if you want to avoid grinding. If you stick to your favorite 4 or even just your favorite 6 characters, you'll find yourself having a harder time once you get to the Phoenix Cave or Kefka's Tower. This is another area where Magicite gums up the works a bit. As I previously stated, once you get to the World of Ruin, you'll start finding a lot of character abilities that were useful are now decidedly less so. Magic has outclassed once powerful abilities like Cyan's Sword Tech, Edgar's Tools, or a good chunk of Gal's Rages, assuming you had the patience to learn and explore them on the Veldt. There's also a matter of player preference, such as my own distaste for the unpredictability of Setzer's slots. Some players may not want Mog to be locked into his dance ability every round of combat. Without these abilities, each character's use is determined by the spells they've learned. Because you have to trek through the World of Ruin and various dungeons in order to find and retrieve each party member, the earliest characters you find will have the greatest stat boost and spells learned compared to those you find last. This is even more likely with characters like Strago and Realm, who arrive so late into the World of Balance that they'll no doubt have fewer spells learned before the party separates in the World of Ruin. It would also be no surprise if many players found their unique abilities the least useful, if only due to getting the least mileage out of them. Speaking optimistically, the system at least allows you to turn less preferable characters into powerful spell slingers. Setzer was one of my stronger mages by the game's end, for example, and Gal himself easily could have been a similar contender. But this essentially means you're turning that diverse set of characters into a dozen copies of the same kind of mage. Once more, I can hear the objections regarding how certain characters can be totally broken if you just use these relics or take advantage of that exploit. But does the game steer the player that direction naturally? Most players are going to follow the path of least resistance, or stubbornly apply old strategies that once worked but no longer do. Again, just like the once powerful tools of Edgar. I find it a shame because you can classify these characters in ways that fit specific roles. Edgar and Sabin both have high-powered attacks that target single or multiple enemies, which means it is best to keep them in separate parties. Similarly, Celeste and Terra start out as your sole spellcasters and thus only healers, so it is also best to split them into separate teams. That you can see the potential of these roles as early as the battlefield of Narsh indicates how the game could have turned out in the long run. Clearly the developers wanted to mentally prepare the player for the party split at Kefka's Tower even this early, but it requires far more knowledge and work of the game's inner mechanics to keep each character's unique abilities relevantly powerful, especially compared to handing them some Magicite and unleashing Mystic Carnage. Final Fantasy VI offers a lot of customization of the party and its characters, but such customization is only worthwhile to repeat players looking to explore the systems more deeply, rather than those coming in for the first time. As a result, that large cast of characters ends up being a lot of maintenance if you're trying to avoid grinding, and especially if you're keeping them all equally leveled. You'll inevitably have characters that are far more useful than others, which begs the question of why have such a large cast at all. I'd love to say that the writing is what breathes life into every party member even when the mechanics fail to, but it's pretty clear not everyone in the cast was given as much thought and care. Mog, especially in translation, feels like a hip 90s animal mascot with no greater purpose to fight than an old Esper telling him so in a dream. Gal feels as if he's brushed under the rug once the band is back together. Once Terra morphs into her Esper form, it feels like Cyan, Edgar, and Sabin lose their overall importance to the story. However, this isn't entirely a flaw, but more the result of the development team's decision to have no central protagonist. The goal was instead to have a collection of people caught up in this grand conflict, and to that end it's understandable that no single group of characters are intended to dominate the narrative. Instead, optional scenes are available in certain locations based on who you have in your party. Bring Locke to Collinghen and you uncover the lost love he failed to protect. Have Edgar and Sabin in your party when you return to Figaro Castle and you can witness the decision that led to one succeeding the throne and the other finding his freedom. And if they're both in the party when you first meet Setzer, you'll get a far better understanding of what kind of a brother Edgar is. Recall, however, that the game is designed with a rotation of characters in mind. If you're planning on playing Final Fantasy VI multiple times, then this provides an opportunity to discover new scenes and story each return playthrough. The problem is, regardless of your decision, this largely means the player benefits from keeping Edgar, Sabin, and Locke in the party for the majority of the World of Balance's missions. Locke in particular is frequently favored by the narrative. The Opera House, Vector, and Thamasa all require Locke to be present in the party. Include the optional scene at Thamasa and he's almost dominating the first half of the game. The World of Ruin allows some of the lesser focused characters their own opportunity in the spotlight, but once again there's that element of care. Cyan not only has a quest dedicated to his rejoining the party, but also a separate quest regarding his own personal demons. Strago is easily recruited with no explanation to his joining the cult of Kefka, and then has a personal quest that feels in part like a joke rather than closure to some dramatic backstory. Relm's depth as a character lies completely upon Shadow's dreams, in which you discover she is his daughter. Strago and Relm, and Mog and Gal themselves, feel like throwaway characters in comparison to everyone else, especially Terra's battle to come to terms with her half-human, half-Esper lineage, or Locke's discovery of the Phoenix Magicite and his final conversation with his long-lost love. I respect the decision to have no central protagonist, and I think the development team tried to stitch together a truly colorful collection of personalities. However, the only reason there's as many as there are is so the player could have 3 full parties in Kefka's tower. Not only did the story not need so many characters, but it demands the cast be kept in heavy rotation in order to ensure they're all properly leveled. A far easier task of the story didn't so clearly favor some characters over others. In the end, it simply feels like the game is actively working against its own decision to have so many potential members of the party. The destruction of the world is certainly a surprising moment of Final Fantasy VI, but it serves as a greater purpose than shock value. It represents the permanency and inevitability of change and loss. Throughout the world of Ruin, you'll encounter a number of people that mourn for the old days, longing for a return to such blissful times. There are even hints at the loss of innocence suffered. When you find Cyan, he's sending letters to a woman in the guise of her lover, a man now dead. Rather than allowing her to move on, he sustained that desperate hope for her to maintain some of life's past joy. She was a kindred spirit to Cyan, who has failed to let go of his own lost family and kingdom. Ultimately, what you have are characters fighting against despair. In some ways, it manifests as finding a reason to live, and in other ways, as simple a concept as perseverance. I think it's most accurate to say that the game focuses on finding your place. It's why the final dialogue with Kefka sounds like a self-help booklet on the power of friendship. It's not necessarily that the characters found a reason to live in each other, as once Kefka is destroyed, they'll all go their separate ways. It's in having that place, literal or figurative, in the world. The young woman Cyan corresponded with was tying herself to the old world, an old love, and thus a life that no longer existed. Cyan himself was drifting without his place as a husband, father, and a servant to his kingdom. Locke continues to wander the world in search of a secret treasure to bring his lost love back to life. Each is a character unwilling to let go of their former lives. But let's switch gears a moment and zoom in on Terra, whose entire struggle is in accepting that she is half human and half Esper. Fearful that she is actually a monster, she is unable to unleash her full strength until she comes to terms with her split nature. Terra's own struggles can be perceived as a personal interpretation of the world's own millennia-spanning conflict. The warring triad, 3 gods locked in constant battle, created the mystical Espers from the human race. These mystical creations were used as weapons of war until the 3 gods became exhausted, looking into the eyes of one another to seal themselves away in stone. At this point, humans and Espers were able to coexist for a while, but in time, humans began trying to use the power of Espers to wage war. This broke out in the War of the Magi, which in turn would lead to the Espers sequestering themselves into their own personal corner of the world, all of which comes to an end when Terra's mother first crosses over, and then when the Empire breaks through shortly after. Just as Terra is frightened of her own power, the Espers themselves are afraid of the potential destruction that can come from the abuse of their kind's destructive capabilities. The game's solution to this conundrum is to eliminate magic from the equation. The old world is permanently destroyed by Kefka, but the heroes are able to create a new world without the warring gods or the destructive power of their magic. Once the warring triad, the source of the Espers and their power, are destroyed, all magic is wiped out, including the Espers themselves. The half of Terra that caused her so much pain, be it as a tool of the Empire or the isolation caused by her heritage, is cast off as she welcomes a new world with a new role, not as a soldier or a weapon, but as a caretaker. Likewise, the many characters must leave their past selves behind. Just as the world has permanently changed, they too are born anew. To this end, Final Fantasy VI is a story about change, especially in the face of tragedy, leading to rebirth. No discussion of Final Fantasy VI would be complete without Kefka. He's a truly unique figure among the Final Fantasy pantheon of villains, both in terms of comedic, snobbish personality and his success in actually destroying the world. But in the years that have followed since the game's release, I can't help but wonder if there's a misunderstanding as to why he works so well as an antagonist. Terra's unconscious flashback near the game's beginning is our first introduction to him, and we certainly get a sadistic sense of pleasure from his laughter as she hypnotically slaughters the Empire's own troops. I imagine that players would more commonly recall his visit to Figaro Castle as his first appearance, however, and as a result, the first impression is that he's a snobbish, selfish henchman incapable of posing a threat without his accompanying guard. He orders them to clean sand off his boots, presumably orders them to set Figaro to flames, and then commands them to chase down our heroes. Never in this introduction does he dirty his own hands. He doesn't seem all too different in the second encounter with him. He flees every time Sabin tries to confront him, leaving a soldier to delay the party while he makes his escape. It is only when he is alone that we see him get his hands dirty, and it is through the indirect and underhanded method of poisoning Doma Castle's water source. This is the first time the player is forced to recognize Kefka as a threat, but a threat that was only able to enact his will once General Leo was out of the picture. And I would like to take this opportunity to suggest, though it's not confirmed in-game, that Emperor Gestal intentionally called General Leo away specifically so Kefka could take care of the Doma situation more swiftly. It fits in with what we later see of the Emperor's personality, and would help further establish him as a potential primary antagonist. We know the Empire are the dreadful villains, and we also know that Emperor Gestal is underhanded enough to pretend to imprison Kefka to convince the heroes that he's turned over a new leaf. He's willing to lie in order to get what he wants, and he even goes so far as to kill, or at least harm, a woman so that he may steal her half-Esper child. So it's no surprise that Gestal would trust Kefka so much more than General Leo. I mean, logically speaking, why not send Leo to take care of the rebels and reclaim the Esper of Narsh instead of Kefka? And the answer is that Leo would be too merciful and try to strike a peaceful solution. Kefka would just get it done no matter how much blood needs to be shed. So it's no surprise when General Leo believes he is meant to make peace with the Espers, but is actually a mere pawn to draw them into the open. It is this scene that I think solidifies Kefka's status as a proper threat. He is twistedly jovial as he transforms the different Espers into Magicite. He even masquerades as the Emperor before General Leo's eyes, mocking the honest man's loyalty and values before dealing the killing blow. He doesn't merely want Leo dead, he wants to watch him suffer. It is no surprise then that Kefka would be side by side with Gestal on the floating continent. But this is where the difference between the two, and therefore the difference between Kefka and all other Final Fantasy villains, becomes clear. Gestal, like most villains, has a vision. A selfish and predictable vision to rule over a new world, but a vision nonetheless. Kefka has no such ambition. He's impulsive and simply finds joy in making others suffer. Gestal may find Kefka useful in enacting his will up to this point, but Gestal was only useful to Kefka for allowing him the opportunity to enjoy his sadistic desires. So once Kefka finds himself wounded by Celeste, the impulsive creature calls upon the power of the gods not to rule the world, but enact an immediate desire for vengeance. It's merely because he's angry and is reaching for the closest tool to give him an advantage. This moment is fondly remembered for being quite jaw-dropping to a lot of players, and I know for my siblings and I, we couldn't believe our eyes. For years though, we misinterpreted the significance of this moment. It's not that Kefka won, as that would imply Kefka was in competition for this power. It's significant because the worst possible person to have such power, someone with no ambition or emotional ties or care for their fellow human being, came to have it. A complete sadist and nihilist won the power of the gods. And Final Fantasy has never had such a villain since. Each of them has been driven by some deeper motivation, but Kefka is simple. He is destruction, and most significantly, he is destruction without rebirth. If you followed the tone of this video so far, you'll find that I've been quite critical of the gameplay and design while finding favor with the narrative. I imagine anyone reading the game's text on screen may raise an eyebrow given some of my praise. A lot of dialogue had to get simplified and truncated back in the 90s, and the Super Nintendo translation had a lot of time constraints that gave rise to several problems. So what was it that made this game special? Why did it impact so many of us old fogies that we continue to insist on its greatness? Well, what you have to understand is that, around 1994, the mainstream consciousness was more obsessed with games like Mortal Kombat and all its gory glory. Even PC games like System Shock were being overshadowed by the carnage of Doom 2. Games are still viewed by many adults and parents as toys, and when mature content was considered, it was always limited to bloody violence and, occasionally, sex. In this way, Squaresoft was a company that was always pushing the boundaries of what a video game could be, rather than the edginess of its content. Final Fantasy IV may have been the game that taught me you could tell a dramatic story in this medium, but Final Fantasy VI seemed to be testing the limits of what you could achieve, and nothing encapsulates that as much as the opera. I've had a lot of people tell me that this sounds bad, but you know what? I don't care. I don't care that, to modern ears and sensibilities, this might sound awful. Even the story-heavy PC games weren't trying to create set pieces as ambitious as a 16-bit opera. This isn't played for laughs, it is played with complete sincerity, and for that reason it has become a hallmark of the entire franchise. And that's why Final Fantasy VI is beloved to so many. The moody tone of 3 Imperial war machines marching in the snow towards an unsuspecting town in the distance, credits scrolling by above. It let players in 1994 know that this was going to be different from other games. The absurd transformation of Figaro Castle into a subterranean transport. The poisoning of an entire people and loss of one's family. Forced to stand on a train platform as your friend mourns, knowing there's nothing you can do to help him. The momentous approach to the Imperial capital. The splitting of the Earth and descendants of the floating continent. The already discussed end of the world. The victorious rise of a new airship and the new hope it represents. Even the closing credits just feel like the product of a team that wouldn't settle for anything less than groundbreaking. So many unique sprites used for just a few closing moments, yet you get a real sense of passion that went into the final product. 25 years later, Final Fantasy VI has certainly been surpassed, but back in 1994, there was nothing like this. It was a landmark title, and despite all of the flaws it had, they were easily overshadowed by the towering accomplishments. This is a game that was built with a passion for the medium and desire to see it go further, and for that reason it earned a permanent place in the hearts of many when it released. So with all that said, is Final Fantasy VI a great game? Did it age well? Is it something people should go back and play? Well, the only definitive answer I can give is that Final Fantasy VI most certainly was a great game despite its flaws, but whether it will be for you today is a question I cannot answer. What I will say is that Final Fantasy VI is an important game in the medium's history. With the right mindset, I think a lot of players going back to it for the first time could find a game to enjoy, and perhaps even a new favorite to return to. There are timeless elements to it, and for me it was honestly a breath of fresh air amid all the modern games I've been playing. At the same time, role-playing games have moved in so many directions that it doesn't surprise me that this would come off as boring to some of my friends that never played it before. Whether it's your preference or not, though, doesn't change the fact that Final Fantasy VI is by no means a bad game, and I think has sufficiently earned the right to be called a classic. Speaking of, if you guys would like to see me cover more classic titles like this, then please leave a note in the comments. I think I'll be covering Final Fantasy IX next now that it's released on Switch, but if you'd like to see me give this same treatment to games like Secret of Mana or Earthbound in the future, then please let me know. And as always, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this with anyone you think would enjoy a deep, critical dive into Final Fantasy VI. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.